Hi, and welcome to this international lecture series, the first one for 2026. So, welcome to this. Today we will have a presentation. We're pleased to welcome Kristian Olesen from Aalborg University. Very welcome here. You have done a lot of research on strategic spatial planning, so it will be very interesting for us to hear more about this. And you will hold a presentation about reviving strategic spatial planning for the major planning challenges of our time. So we will first hear you present this, and then we will have a discussion afterwards with you. So please.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Christina. You hear me all right? Yes. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for being here. Yes, I have a presentation where mainly what I'll talk about is strategic spatial planning, and I'll of course introduce to you what it is and what I mean by it. Some of you would probably know some of it already. And then, one of the main things I want to get across and talk about is also how we can revive or rethink the idea of strategic spatial planning, and I'll explain why I think that is needed, of course. And a lot of one of the other things I want to say something about is the role of planning. So I know many of you studying planning or having the idea of wanting to become an urban planner in the future, and I think there's some important things to say also in terms of planning's role in society, what it should do, and the role of the planners within that. So bridging to some of that hopefully would also be interesting, and trying to bridge that a little bit in the end to the Swedish context that I know something about, but not too much. I'm sure you know much more about it than me, of course, but maybe that could be where we could open up for the discussion towards the end. Let me see if I can change my slides. Yes, I just a little bit of introduction to myself, of course. Kristian Olesen, I'm an associate professor in strategic spatial planning at Aalborg University in Denmark. And if you don't know where Aalborg is the city in Jutland, or the peninsula attached to Germany at the far north, the red dot on the map there, which is the front page of my PhD. I'm trained as a planner. I have a master's degree in urban planning and management, also from Aalborg University. And then I did my PhD on strategic spatial planning in Denmark. And I'll start my presentation, my talk, talking a little bit about what I did in my PhD and then how that led to my interest, research-wise, in the relationship between planning and politics, both in terms of how planning and planners can do something in terms of shaping politics, shaping our world, our planet for the better, but also how politics interfere in planning and how politicians have ideas about what planning should be and what planning should not be, and what planners shouldn't interfere in, if you would like. So that's that would be my introduction. And then I should also say that I'm part of a research group called Planning for Urban Sustainability, where we look at different sectors, mobility, water, housing, and so on, from sort of an urban sustainability perspective. And we actually just have a new book out, which tries to go through these different ways of encountering urban sustainability. But where I want to start my story is with my PhD research. Some years ago now, in 2006 in Denmark, we made a national spatial plan, which we've done in the past, but this was sort of a new plan, a new way of approaching it, and the plan was called the New Map of Denmark. So the idea here was we had a structural reform in Denmark, a governance reform, which essentially meant that we abolished our counties and then we created 5 new larger regions, which is what you see here on the map. But then at the same time, we have 2 major city regions, urban conurbations in Denmark, which is what these two circles on the map illustrates. So, and the idea was that these two major city regions doesn't really fit the boundaries, the borders of the new regions. So we have to think about spatial planning as related to spaces that are not governed administratively by having a major administration and so on, as you would have in the regions. So what the Ministry of Environment, which was responsible for planning in Denmark at the time, did was to create new, they call it dialogue processes, dialogue projects, where they brought together the Minister of Environment, the Minister of Transport, and then the municipalities within these circles, in order to come up with a spatial plan or ideas for how to coordinate urban development, public transport infrastructure, preservation of green spaces, and these kind of things that we do, strategic spatial planning wise. Part of the idea was here that we needed a different type of spatial planning, a different type of urban planning, because society changes, so planning should also change to reflect those changes. So one of the illustrations from that publications, from that report, was what you see here, where it's saying that there's a lot of different things going on in society, different societal changes. We could put globalization as being the umbrella term to describe that. And those changes means that we have to think about planning in a slightly different way than in the past, or it creates some new challenges, which would be the bullet points you see there on the left side of the screen. So the idea is we need somehow to strengthen planning or change planning into something else so we can address these new challenges that we could call globalization. And this was essentially what the new strategic spatial planning should do in a Danish context. So what happened was also that the Ministry of the Environment particularly, but also the Minister of Transport had these ideas about a little bit old-fashioned planning-wise, but if you could make a plan, think about where urban development should be, and if you could coordinate it with new investments in public infrastructure, then you could somehow make a more sustainable urban development at the scale of city region. But it has to be more informal because, there was no statutory plan, there was no legal foundation for this because it was sort of outside the planning system. So you had to get the municipalities to agree on it. So that's where these dialogue processes came in. So those processes that I followed in my PhD was in these two circles, and there actually was a third one over here also. What happened was several things. The ministry tried a little bit to top-down push for a plan. The municipalities had a slightly different understanding of what strategic spatial planning was about. They were more interested in creating economic growth, urban development, saw planning as a way to strengthen their competitiveness, and had a difficulty seeing how more regulation could help them be more competitive. They were interested in getting new public transport infrastructures, of course, but this thing about reducing their ability to plan for urban development were they not interested in. What happened then was that the Minister of Environment we had at the time was called Connie Hedegaard, and then she became the EU Commissioner for the climate change. So she left. And then the new minister we got was from the Liberal Party. And he had a slightly different idea of what planning was about and how much national planning you should have. So essentially this process that I started following my PhD turned into be more a process about how politics and certain political ideas that I then came to call neoliberalism and neoliberal ideas, how they influence planning, and have certain ideas about how much planning we should have at a national level, at a municipal level, at a very local level. So what started out as an innovative strategic spatial planning process ended out with planning being a little bit in crisis. We're not knowing what planning at this level should be about. At this level being the national level, but also these fuzzy regions that we try to do planning. So that's a very long introduction, of course. But one of the things that I've been interested in as a consequence of this is arguments for why we should plan and what the arguments are from those being critical of planning in terms of why we shouldn't. And Richard Clusterman wrote a paper many years ago now, in the mid-80s. It's called Arguments for and Against Planning. But it's quite nice in the sense of, if you haven't read it, then I invite you to do it, because it takes, talk through what the arguments for and against planning is from different perspectives. Economic perspectives, Marxist perspectives, pluralist perspectives, and so on and so on. But one of the nice things he's saying in it, which of course resonated in the 1980s, but also today, I think, saying that planning is increasingly under attack around the world in the political arena, the popular press, and the academic literature. So that became sort of the starting point for me in my further research. And one of the things I did with a colleague was, at a certain point in Denmark, we had this idea we wanted to reform our Planning Act, and it's actually something we did in several steps. But in the very first step, the idea was we need to reform planning radically. It needs to change fundamentally. So what me and my colleague did was to look at the popular press to see how's planning being talked about in newspaper articles, in professional academic magazines, and so on. And then we did a discourse analysis. And essentially, we saw one major discourse forming: planning as a barrier for growth, which was the main argument being put forward why we need to transform planning, why we need to change the regulation, why we need to deregulate planning, have less regulation. Because planning is seen as a barrier for growth. Where you could say, yes, of course it is, because we want to regulate urban sprawl and these kind of things. That's the idea with planning. And we have something that's the urban areas, and then we have the countryside that should somehow be less urban. But here the idea is we need growth everywhere. Also in the rural side, also in the periphery, also by the coast. And that planning is in the way. And then back to the new minister for planning, and then planning also as part of this reform was transferred from being located in the Ministry of Environment to in a new ministry called the Ministry of Businesses and Growth. So this is where planning was housed. And we added a bullet point to the first paragraph of the Planning Act, which lists all the things that planning should do. And the new point that planning also should do was to create good conditions for businesses and growth. So this is the new task for planning. It's always done that in the past, of course, but now it was put up and sided together with affordable housing and all these kind of things. And the minister had certain quite liberal ideas about planning, and this is from a quote saying that the Planning Act is something, he's saying it a little bit longer because he's a politician, but essentially what he means is it's something the Social Democrat has invented, something that belongs to the welfare state. It's not something you should be happy about, something we need to do something about. And that's sort of been the motto, if you like, ever since. And now he's the prime person from the Liberal Party in Denmark, so still going on with these ideas. So this idea about a crisis in planning and a critique of planning, and that somehow we as planners need to be better to explain why we do planning and what it's for, and need to get politicians to understand that, I think is something very important. So that was my one point. I'm just gonna move a little bit to a different thing and then come back again, because I want to talk about strategic spatial planning. And just to introduce it, so you know what I mean by it, and those of you who are not familiar with the term would get a quick introduction. So essentially, in the beginning of the 1990s, there was this idea that we need a different planning. We need to do planning in a different way. We've been through the 1980s, that some of you would know. We had Margaret Thatcher in the UK, Ronald Reagan, in the US. In Denmark, we had also conservatives, political parties, and so on. So planning wasn't really a big thing. And there was this idea maybe the state should be smaller. So what we, in the planning community, both academia and in practice, invented this new thing, strategic spatial planning, which was essentially to create this plan that was non-statutory, a bit like my example before. And this was a trend going on in Europe at the time in the beginning of the 1990s. So different city regions or cities did this. Barcelona was one of the first ones in relation to the Olympics in '92, used that as a starting point for doing strategic planning. Then one of the other things is that we introduced a new vocabulary, a new way to talk about planning, and borrowed some ideas, imported some ideas from the private sector. So a lot of you would be familiar with what a SWOT analysis is, a stakeholder analysis is, and so on, which essentially ideas which come out of business management planning from the US in the 1960s. Then sort of gradually came into the public sector and the nonprofit sector in the US, and then traveled, if you like, to Europe in the 1990s. So the point here was let's talk about planning in a new way, where it's easier for politicians and others to see why it's relevant. So the idea here was, as the quote says, to change the discourse about whether we should do planning, yes or no, to let's talk about how we can do planning, how we can do planning and adjust planning to this new context, which is what strategic spatial planning then tried to do. So one of the other things that we wanted to do at this time was to politicize planning. So we had this idea in the past from sort of rational planning that, separation from means and ends, separation from planning and politics. Politicians decide the goals and planners come up with the means to achieve those goals. And here we mix things a little bit, trying to politicize planning, essentially meaning making planning interesting for politicians. Because there was also the idea that politicians don't care about planning and therefore don't understand it. And then there was a whole idea about Europeanization and more professionalization of planning, creating planning schools, planning education, planners is a real thing, and so on. And coupled to that, the new sustainability discourse that came out with the Brundtland Commission report, Our Common Future, Vores Fælles Fremtid, from 99, I think it was. So this created a new momentum for spatial planning. And essentially the idea was to move away from thinking planning as land use planning, so something that control growth and the use of land, to planning being more about creating strategic plans, having visions, and combined with that short-term actions. So one of the problems with planning in the past was that it was very good at preventing things from happening that we didn't want to see happen. Preventing the countryside, preserving the environment, all these kind of things. What planning couldn't do was to make sure that the things we would like to see happen actually happens. Because we have no way of telling people to deploy their resources, their money in a certain way. We can make a plan and hope that investors would build affordable housing, but we can't force them to. So the idea with strategic planning was to create plans that are more persuasive, include different stakeholders, actors that we need to help us to do the things that we want to do. And then help them also to decide what to do, and then there's a greater chance that what we would like to see happen is actually happening. So doing planning in a governance context, if you like. And in Denmark, this led to a whole new way of doing planning, a whole new approach. And some of you know the Olesen region, this cross-border region between Denmark and Skåne, which emerged around this time and year to build the bridge across to Eurozone and have a whole big city region in order to increase the competitiveness, but also the flow of goods and people and all these kind of things between the two countries. Another thing we did was we used to have these national planning reports that came out every year with a lot of statistics about how the country is doing. What we did then was to transform these documents into more political documents, and then they came out every fourth year, connected to the elections to the Danish parliament. So essentially these documents became a way for the new elected government to say something about how they see the map of Denmark, how they see what should happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years, which became these new national planning reports. And then we also revived the idea. We had maybe, you know, the famous finger plan for the greater Copenhagen area. And that plan we revived again with the idea to have a more tight framework to control the urban planning. So here we also see a little bit more top-down regulation, which is one of the last things we managed to do before then strategic spatial planning fell a bit apart again in a Danish context. Because one of the things we then started to see in Europe already in the beginning of the 2000s or mid-2000s was this sort of increasing planning skepticism and critique again. So that critique and those ideas from the 80s that we tried to address by reinventing planning somehow came back in a different way, in a different form in the mid-2000s. And here different sort of quotes demonstrating that. So the first one saying here, by the mid-2000s, across Europe, strategic spatial planning was experiencing difficulties. A crisis of strategic spatial planning seemed to be emerging, furthered by a strengthening of a neoliberal political climate. And then the second quote from a study comparing strategic spatial planning in England, Germany, and France, saying here that everywhere in these three countries, the focus of spatial planning has been narrowed down to concentrate on facilitating economic development, competitive regions. Spatial planning, albeit in different ways, has become framed and molded within a larger picture of economic growth, deregulation, and reduction of administrative complexity, for instances for acquiring planning permission. Decentralizing and re-centralizing of power, a shift towards private sector and civil society involvement, and a focus on more efficient, effective, and project-oriented policy delivery. So essentially, this quote says a lot about what's been going on and the ideas that was around that planning somehow is in the way and it needs to change again. So one of the things that I've been interested in is trying to, explain that. And explain those changes and how can we understand that, those sort of ups and downs of planning being we are for planning, we are against planning, and for me neoliberalism or neoliberalization is a good way of doing it. So that's what I've been working with. So essentially the argument here is just saying that how we can understand this where we tend to prioritize economic growth above anything else. Neoliberalization is a very good way to try to understand that for me. So developing an understanding of the relationship between neoliberalism and strategic spatial planning and the different ways of neoliberalization is important also if we are to think about how to rethink planning in a more critical way. So the frame of understanding that I've built up together with others, of course, is this understanding of waves of neoliberalization influencing planning. And if you don't know what I mean by neoliberalism or neoliberalization, hopefully it will be more clear by the end of this slide. But we have this idea within neoliberalism that the market is a better way to organize society and allocate resources than anything else that the state can do. So a lot of it is about privatization or decentralization, outsourcing, which is an understanding of neoliberalism that's very associated with Margaret Thatcher in the UA and so on, UK, sorry, which is about withdrawal of the state, the state pulling itself back, which relates very much to a critique about planning, but also just the central role of the state and bureaucracy in society. But it's also very much related to something that happened in the 1980s, which is a long time ago. So what we see in the 1990s is a different form of neoliberalization, roll-out neoliberalization, where the state is then rolled out again, if you like, So state functions being reintroduced, but introduced in a way to support the market or create new markets, in a sense. So where the state, in a way, it's acting in a way how it's reinventing also planning is to support the market, support private investments, which for me is very much what strategic spatial planning then did or said it wanted to do alongside the sustainability. And then with the rollout neoliberalism, it's a bit newer term, but essentially is describing how these ideas within neoliberalism is becoming more normalized and accepted, taken for granted, and not just belonging to a particular political parties on the right, but also very ingrained in the thinking that we have in some more left or central political parties. The Social Democratic Party in Denmark would also very much accept a lot of these premises. So in a sense, that has led to a critique of planning and critique of strategic spatial planning, and these constant reforms that we've seen in Denmark of the Planning Act and elsewhere, where planning is sort of searching for new arguments and trying to legitimize itself and why we should do it in society, and how much of it we should have, and how much of it should be regulation, minimum regulation, and how much of a more strategic planning is also needed. So here, and we haven't really found the answer to that question yet, is my argument, and that is of course what we need to do. So that's one of the big challenges. So how I see this and how I see this development of these ups and downs, try to put into this sort of maybe a bit long quote. Sorry about that. But this is the best I have until now. So I think I might just read it out. Where I say here that the institutional conditions for and political legitimacy of planning have always been greater in times of economic growth and prosperity, whilst planning has struggled to maintain its political support in times of economic crisis. This is perhaps especially true for strategic spatial planning, which, due to its strategic, experimental, and often informal nature, often is perceived to be more relevant in times of economic growth, where decisions of where to guide urban development must be made. Strategic spatial planning seems to have less to offer in times of economic crisis and austerity policies. Consequently, we've seen a reduced interest in strategic spatial planning experiments and abolishment of formal strategic spatial planning in many European countries in the last 10-15 years, following the global financial crisis in 7-8-ish. The lack of political support for strategic spatial planning can also be understood as a result of an increasing neoliberal political climate in many European countries. I think Denmark and Sweden included here. One of the things that we've seen recently in Denmark is, and I'll come back to this, but this idea about having a national spatial planning report or plan has disappeared. Or rather, the changes in the Planning Act say that the government do not have to do it, and then they don't. And then we've had the continuous reforms of the Planning Act. We really, it's revived every year. And some of these reforms are bigger than others. Some of the reforms put in good things, also in terms of sustainability and climate change and all these new topics coming in. But a lot of it is also to make planning much more growth-friendly, in a sense. And every time there's a press conference or press release, why the minister explaining why we're doing it is always with the growth angle on it. And we have there's been a lot of talk about the finger plan recently, where the minister wanted to modernize it and essentially had this idea: just let's throw everything up in the air and let's do a new plan and see. Let's not stick to the old stuff. And then some of us went to the media to criticize that you can't just throw everything up. That's sort of 75 years of planning history, and that's how Copenhagen is organized today. So you need a little bit of understanding of what's going on here. So there are a lot of interesting things going on, and a lot of it is quite populistic, if you like. And often what's being said in the media is quite, blown out of proportion, and what happens in reality, luckily until now, is quite small changes, more incremental changes. Just see how I'm doing on time. Okay, so that was sort of, the first part of my lecture. Sort of a fly-in, if you like, to talk more about if there is a need for strategic spatial planning today. And my answer is, of course, yes. But we also have to think about how and why in this. And I think my main point and my sort of takeaway point from me today is yes, but we sort of have a responsibility as planners or people interested in planning to demonstrate how planning is relevant today. So planning has to be able to say something, help contribute to solve or address some of the main challenges we have in our society today. And there's plenty to choose from. So in that sense, it's that's not a problem, but we have to make planning more immediately relevant. So we cannot assume that others would know what planning is, or assume that they would accept that planning is needed when we explain what it is about. So some of the two themes, two topics that I've been interested in the last maybe 5 years or so is the energy crisis and the housing crisis, which for me is two of the big things. I mean, there are several to choose from, I know, but for me, that's two of the big things going on right now where I feel planning has something to offer. And also pointing out that the EU have appointed a commissioner for energy and housing, which shows that the EU are taking these crises and issues seriously, and even appointed a Dane as the European Commissioner. So that's also interesting coming from Denmark, but also interesting in terms of some of the ideas from Denmark in terms of how to deal with these issues and then coming into a more European audience. Which is also an opportunity, of course, research-wise. Just one moment, please. So I'm just going to take one of each of these crises at a time and explain how I see it. So the energy crisis, just so we are on the same page, if you like, with what we mean by it. I suppose you have a fairly good idea of what it may entail, but of course we have this challenge that we want to transition towards 100% renewable energy. And in the EU we have 2050 as a goal, and many countries and cities have adopted the 2050 target also, which is more easier said than done, you may say. Because we are still quite reliant on fossil fuels, which with the sort of changing geopolitical situation is making things even more challenging. We essentially rely on imports quite a lot from countries that we don't agree with at the moment. So that's in a way an incentive to accelerate that transition, but it also means that the whole situation, the energy discussion has changed quite a lot in the last 5 years. With energy security coming in as main issues, and we being afraid of being hacked, or I suppose in Denmark and also Sweden we have drones flying in the airport and all these kind of things that we are unsure about what's happening. And with the electrification of all sectors, we're more vulnerable. So this sort of protection of critical infrastructure has become much more important, especially related to energy, but also to other sectors, of course. And with the less reliance on fossil fuels and wanted to do this transition, we've also seen an increase in energy prices for some consumers in some parts of the country, or in some countries more than others. So these issues with energy poverty and energy justice have come up. They probably existed for some time, but at least for me, the last 5 years, it's really been increasing interest and discussion on these kind of issues, which is quite interesting for me because it brings a spatial dimension and the geography into discussions about energy that I don't think we've seen to that extent before. And then, of course, we have I want to say the good old discussion about where these new infrastructures for renewable energy should be located, which is essentially an old discussion, but being accelerated in the sense that the amount and the size of energy infrastructures we are planning for, right now are much bigger, much larger than what we've seen in the past. In Denmark, we want to quadruple the amount of renewable energy we're producing from, I think, 2020 to 2030 or something like that, 4 times the amount. And we are producing quite a lot already. And this is, of course, because we also see an increase in the demand on energy. We have data centers coming in. We have this idea about power to X as a way to store energy or translate energy into different forms. We have electrification of every possible sector. So of course the energy demand is going to increase dramatically and has increased dramatically. And at least in Denmark, the grid hasn't been upgraded. So we have issues with the grid can't facilitate these transactions from A to B. So there's congestion on the grid. So if you imagine the grid as just being a motorway and just we have more electrons, more cars coming in, and we just keep doing that without expanding the road network, then I don't know if it still works, the analogy, but then it's definitely slower and then you can't really facilitate what you want. And I was involved in research projects together with colleagues in the Netherlands, and they've just sort of a bit more random ad hoc built a lot of these solar parks on fields that we're also doing in Denmark. But that also mean that without necessarily having any idea of where energy is produced and where it's used. So that creates quite a lot of congestion on the grid when things have to move from A to B. So right now they are in a situation where urban development has been put on standby in certain regions because they cannot guarantee electricity. Businesses can't expand because there's no more capacity on the grid. So everything is sort of urban development-wise stopping because energy and urban planning haven't been thought together. So for me, this is a very good example of this is obvious we need more strategic spatial planning. And we cannot just do it on a very local level. We actually need to do it at a city level, regional level, and essentially, at least in the size of Denmark, we could do it on a national level. We should be able to do it on a national level. Yeah, I think that's what I wanted to say with that. So for me, there are some quite critical questions that planning in a broad sense could come in with here, which is there's something about where the infrastructure should be located. Of course, is it in the urban areas where we maybe have the greatest demand, the need, or is it the rural areas where we have more space for these facilities? Are we talking about, at least in Denmark and also Sweden, we have the sort of central heating, which is slightly centralized, but in a decentralized way of delivering heat and electricity. But if you bring in the energy security perspective, is it good to have large units or small units? How decentralized should they be? How local should they be? How large should they be? Where should they be localized? And all these kind of things. And how does that fit with the existing grid? Where do we have capacity? Where don't we have capacity? And what about the local support? Or resistance, if you like, from citizens. So there are all these kind of questions which we should address, and I think we are trying to address, but not coherently or holistically or together. And one of the reasons is, of course, that the whole energy sector, electricity-wise, has been liberalized through EU legislation. So it's all market-based. So it's essentially investors, private investors, building these things. And doing it maybe on a more ad hoc basis where there's opportunity. And maybe they look at the grid capacity, maybe they don't. Maybe they look at the availability of land or something else. So somehow this sort of synergy between supply and demand, geographical, social justice, spatial justice, energy justice, how do we take that in? Do we expect, private developers to think about that, or is there a need for some kind of planning to regulate, discipline the market in a way so it does this a bit more efficiently, in a sense? So again, here for me, there is a need for some kind of strategic planning that connects spatial and energy planning, also across scale, from the local scale all the way to the national scale, maybe even international. And I know in sort of the energy planning literature, there is a talk now and has been for some years about strategic energy planning. But the spatial dimension in that gets lost a lot of the time. So one example, just to illustrate how we are approaching this, what we're doing in planning wise in Denmark at the moment is through what we call national energy parks. So in Denmark, at least the Danish government have this idea of a more centralized solution. Big units, really big units. Industrial areas for energy production, if you like. So what the Danish government did was somewhat coordinated with the municipalities and somewhat not coordinated with the municipalities, suddenly just came out with a plan and nominating 26 areas. Here we're going to have the big energy parks. And then, okay. And then I think some municipalities were very much, oh, okay. That's what we're doing. But then saying, this is what we propose. And then it's up to the municipalities themselves to plan for it. And then, of course, developers, saw it as an opportunity, because in the past, if you're planning for putting solar panels on a field, there's all kind of, the quality of the landscape, not too close to the coast, all these kind of planning regulations. But the idea with these national energy parks and the areas designated for that was energy the main priority, so you could overrule some of the other considerations. So investors came in with these ideas that was 3, 4, 5 times the projects they had rejected in the past, because now this was the prime thing to do. So again, quite market-based, investor-driven, and then of course that met a lot of local resistance, because these were like gigantic parks that 5 times the size that the population thought 5 years ago. Another thing is that, out of these 26, 24 of them was placed in Jutland, in the peninsula attached to Germany, and 12 of these in the northern Jutland, the region that I am from, where of course there's space. Some would argue because there's no houses, not that many houses. There are, nature areas and farms and so on. But it raises these questions about, okay, social justice, spatial justice, energy justice. And, some of the mayors been out saying, okay, we are located, I don't know, let's say 500 kilometers from Copenhagen. Why should we be a production unit for Copenhagen energy-wise? That's unfair. We already have an overproduction by whatever, 100% of renewable energy compared to our population. Why should that be 500% or something else? So there are these questions around which we haven't really addressed because we are missing a plan. And we're missing a plan for how to address this that thinks the spatial element into it. some kind of national strategy. So again, here for me, an example where strategic spatial planning should come in. Might just take, no, I'm just going to take this because we had an example. I have an example of how this could be done, maybe. So before we abolished national spatial planning in Denmark, there was a draft in 2022, 2022, where the ministry actually tried to make a sort of a national spatial plan, or at least a report addressing the energy issue in a spatial planning context. So that was quite interesting. Also, when you read between the lines, it talks about this need for a stronger role of the state within a much more market-based way of doing things. There's a need for a more proactive strategic approach, and these kind of formulations you see, we need to move away for a purely market-based way of doing it. So there was this idea somehow we need to set up a framework also where we from national side, in a sense, protect the municipality and the planners there and the residents living there from investment that is inappropriate for where they're living, but at the same time finding ways where we do fulfill the goals of the transition to renewable energy. So essentially that's planning considerations that needs to be taken somehow. And what it also does, quite interesting, is to take this issue with grid capacity in. So here there's definitely people understanding that the grid capacity is a very real thing and really issue to address. And obviously there are plans to expand it, but you can't expand the grid everywhere at the same time. So what is the order? And how does that order of grid expansion relate to where we are producing energy and which facilities are we promoting first? So I guess, I mean, in Denmark, we're talking a lot about power to X, and I suppose you are in Sweden as well. We have no idea what it means, what the X is. There are some projects and so on, but what it requires grid-wise and setup-wise, infrastructure-wise, is still a black box for many. And then I think I might just do this one quickly and then move on, because I also want to talk about housing before I end. But there's a thing called positive energy districts. That's a European idea. So essentially promoted from Brussels. And the idea is that you, on a very small neighborhood scale, have neighborhoods that produce more energy than they use. And then the idea is if you can fix this on a local scale, then you can scale it up to city level and regional level and national level. So and this is a way to fit the energy production. It's a way to think about how we could fit energy production into the urban areas where energy is being used. So solar panels on roof, all these kind of things. But it's also a quite European thought that doesn't necessarily, in my view, fit how we've organized ourselves in Sweden and Denmark with these district heating. Where we have these district heating areas that's much larger geographically, especially in the big cities, than what's being talked about here. And we actually have a nice setup. Not quite sure how it is in Sweden, but in Denmark at least, a lot of the district heating areas and the district heating companies are non-profit, membership-based run. Some of them are municipal run, but others being quite non-profit, which means in a sense they have to break even. And if they're able to, they produce heat and electricity, and if they can sell the electricity off to the market, then the heating gets cheaper. So it's a very nice way, but then these ideas doesn't really fit to that. And another idea with the positive energy districts is you want to have the planning focus in, but it's very difficult to get the planning focus in when you work in a very narrow scale and quite technology focused. So we could talk about a street or just a row of houses, or maybe just a single house. What in between the houses and the scales and the relation between neighborhood, city, and region gets lost in this discussion, because of course some neighborhoods are more easy to fit in technical solutions than others. Okay, that was a bit quick because I just wanted to say a little bit about housing before I have to end. Housing crisis, maybe that doesn't need any introduction, so close to Stockholm. And I guess the issues in Stockholm are actually bigger than in Copenhagen. But essentially, just there's a question about how do we find space for housing where people want to live? How do we build the right housing, meaning housing that's affordable? So housing crisis is often also talking about housing that is affordable for the people and not investment objects for foreign investment, for example. Another related issue to the housing crisis is segregation. So, housing, at least how we've been built housing in the past, has very much been, private ownership, single family housing here, more sort of social housing here. And, you have the Million program in Sweden and so on. So it's quite, spatially separated where the different housing options are, which also means you get this divide and a lack of social coherence in society. So in Denmark, this has been a big discussion, and in many other European countries, of course. How do we fix these neighborhoods that are stigmatized and segregated, and where social uprising and all these kind of things takes place? How do we transform them into more mixed communities? Is one word, more neutral word, I guess, than some of the other suggestions. And again, here my point is spatial planning that connects housing and urban planning is quite important. And what at least coming from Denmark, it's difficult to talk about housing and these issues of segregation without just sort of mentioning the Parallel Society Act. And I suppose some of you would know it, but in Denmark, I guess this is a form of sort of national planning. And there's a spatial dimension in it because we, through the Parallel Society Act, we've sort of pointed towards some areas in Denmark where the problems are greater than others. And then giving them the task of transforming these areas radically by 2030, giving 10 years to do it. And what the policy is saying, very brought into the basic, is that these areas that's almost 100% social housing in 2030 should only consist of 40% social family housing. It's a quite large reduction. It's of course also it's a housing policy, but it's also an immigration policy. Because a lot of the issues you go into is about to what extent people are well integrated or not into the Danish society and what kind of ethnic background they have. That's not the most interesting thing for me here. The most interesting for me here is that you actually want to do something that sounds like planning, transforming neighborhoods into something better, but doing it in a way that's not very planning-like. So we are missing the spatial planning element. And I want to illustrate this for a research project we've been doing the last 4 or 5 years, where we've looked at some of these areas that have issues that are then where the housing association, together with the municipality and private developers, are preparing plans and coming up with ideas and implementing solutions also in order how to transform these neighborhoods with some of these challenges into more mixed communities that would attract residents from a larger, broader spectrum of the population, if you can put it like that. So what we've done was we looked at 4 areas and we picked the areas where we could see that there were some ideas of strategic spatial planning actually. And had some thoughts about what to do. Also before they had to do something. so prior to 2018. The story is, of course, that we in 2010 had this legislation where we created the ghetto list, which is listing a lot of different neighborhoods and benchmarking them on a lot of different criteria to see how well they're performing on education, unemployment, crime, ethnicity, all these kind of things. But what we found here was that the housing associations are actually starting to act as urban developers. They hire architects to do the planning. They hire all otherwise people who know something about planning, know how the municipal planning system works, has context with the private sector, knows how to organize planning processes. So in that way, being much more professional and much more planning-like, and actually driving these processes and getting the municipality along, creating partnerships with private developers, and actually in some cases being quite good at handpicking the right private developers with the right mentality, thinking also with the head and the heart, not just with the wallet in a sense. And consultancies with a social mindset and wanting to do something good, and also pushing the housing associations to be more ambitious in their work, socially wise. So it's been quite a nice process to follow. And of course, there are these spatial planning ideas, but it comes with this spreadsheet thinking, because one of the things that the housing associations, together with the municipalities, had to do was to submit an actual spreadsheet to the ministry saying this is what we want. So in the actual literal sense, this was a spreadsheet exercise. But having the idea, having the mentality to turn this into a spatial planning process. And that's being supported by the interest organization of housing associations, having this sort of agenda and discourse at the moment with sort of strategic network and strategic urban collaborations and all these kind of things to support them. And what we see coming out of this is also that the housing associations then sort of become a more prominent actor in city politics and in discussing housing policy at municipal level or city level, which is then leading municipalities to think about whether they should have a housing policy or housing politics at city level, and to what extent they can involve the housing associations in that, along with private developers. So the housing policy that's been missing at national level for many years now, sort of coming a bit from the bottom up at municipal level, which potentially could lead to something at national level. So again, here, strategic planning is also something that could be done quite locally. Okay, I should end. I have two slides for conclusion. For me, strategic spatial planning, and I like this quote from Pat Healy, where she says, strategic spatial planning brings into focus the way of things. So there's a spatial element. It has to do with where things are put in space, how things are organized in space. So the location of things is quite important. And I think this is one of the things we need to emphasize. But of course, the location of things is also very controversial, political, because it's going to affect somebody. There's going to be winners and losers no matter what. So this is a thing we need to deal with. And then I think in this current, situation where planning is because it's under pressure and there's planning skepticism and maybe not so much political support, we somehow need to demonstrate the added value of planning. Sorry to use a little bit of a business term, but it's maybe that is also partly what we should do, because there's this challenge of strengthening the political interest and understanding of what planning is and what planning is for. So somehow we need to recenter planning as an activity for organizing space. And we also have, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which maybe could act somewhat as a way of doing it. That's at least what some are proposing. So the new sustainability take, if you like. And then I want to end with the role of the planner and bringing it into to a Swedish context. And stole a quote from Kristian and Hilda, one of their research papers, where they're saying that planners in Swedish municipalities have many ideas, visions, initiatives for sustainable development, but are often not informed of the political agenda or how to prioritize. In this sense, despite the planning instruments at hand, planners feel that they lack a mandate and are not able to work strategically. And I thought this quote is saying many things, and it's interesting, but I thought it was interesting to sort of juxtapose it against another study from Christina Grange, also from Sweden, saying here that many Swedish planners advocate an ideal of neutrality with an unwillingness to give voice to professional judgment. And then she goes on, I contend that politics has more to gain from encountering civil servants who dare to raise problems that refer to something beyond themselves than by loyal civil servants that see no other options than to be compliant. So this thing about the obligations that we have as planners to push for the right solution, to put in a sustainable way, on the one hand, make planners interested in planning, on the other hand, but without doing it in a way where we create a wider gap between planning and politics, but somehow use it as a way to bring planning and politics closer together in order to build better places. So essentially, this is now the challenge that I see now, and the challenge that I could pass on to you then as future planners, because I feel there's this need that we build up the confidence of the profession and us as planners, and what we know, without going too far on the other end, back to the 1950s and before, where we maybe were a bit too overconfident, but finding a middle way and finding a new way of doing it. So, and I think that will be my final note, and maybe this is where we could pick up the discussion afterwards. So, thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Kristian, and also very interesting to hear the history of the strategic spatial planning and then coming into the role of the planner. So I think it was a very good ending. I will open up the questions and also at the online, right? You can write at Q&A and then we ask the question, right? But please, we have this catch box. So if you have questions, I can give this to you. Do we have any questions?
Or just thoughts.
Yeah.
Whatever you have. Oh, I should probably be in the camera still, sorry.
You just ended your presentation with, being, as an advice to future planners not to be too overconfident. But now we see the digital tool, for instance, the emergence of urban science is kind of too confident with its role in strategic spatial planning. So I'm wondering what's your take on the impact that this emergence of new digital tools have on strategic spatial planning and the practice of it.
I have to some disclaimer first. Digital tools and all that is not my field of expertise, but it is, of course, an emerging field and something a lot of people are looking to, and it could definitely be a way of sort of strengthening the technical competencies, if you like. This is the expertise and knowledge that planners could have. I could have some concerns about to what extent we should move to be quite, should we be more technical as planners? Is that the right route for us to go? Or should we, with my sort of more strategic spatial planning take, is it a different field of expertise that we should promote and is needed rather than going to more sort of technical rationality and the IT stuff? And there's probably a need for both. And I could be afraid that we go too much in the IT, technology, digital, AI, whatever direction, and then forget some of the more spatial stuff. But I acknowledge, of course, that IT can be used to underline the spatial dimension with GIS and all these kind of things where you bring in the spatial dimension quite clearly. But there's, I think what I want to say is there's different ways of knowing space than what can come out of a GIS analysis. I think other people would be better to answer that question than me. So I sort of talked around it. Sorry about that.
Yes, Timos, do you have? Yeah.
Very fascinating.
Thank you. Very fascinating presentation. And I was thinking about many interesting points related to the way you discuss strategic planning. But one thing that particularly struck me is how you painted this picture of a need for a progressive political agenda around strategic spatial planning, to which I agree. And I'm particularly sort of thinking around what that means given the intractable structural issues that we have with sort of doing this, given the normal tools we have for strategy. So for example, the planners, the municipalities, but so there kind of like maybe a problem of lock-in there in terms of, and I'm just wondering, how do we then enable that kind of progressive political vision? Where is it that we look at that? Is it specific actors, or is it more of a sort of a multi-level?
Yeah.
I think you sort of touched on that, but I was wondering if
you
could return to it.
I think one of the thank you for the question, and I think it's well spotted that there is something there. The example that I sometimes use is, I've worked with these sort of positive energy districts in research projects, and one of the things that sort of strikes me there is it's a lot of the things you promise in these research projects are new innovations, technical solutions, blah 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 blah. But at the end of the day, we have the technical solutions we need. It's not like we need new technical solutions to transition to renewable energy. We have them. They exist, and they're quite old technologies, if you like, wind power, solar power, so on. It's combining them and finding out what fits to a local context that's important. And then I think, again, paraphrasing Kristian and Hilda here, the same for urban planning. I think we have the solutions. I think we know how to organize space in a way to reduce the use of energy, to promote energy efficiency. We know about, coordinating urban development with public transport infrastructures, densities, what is it called? TOD, transit-oriented development. We have these kind of, logics tools. We know what makes urban spaces work. We know what creates segregation and what doesn't. I feel we know. I feel we have the solutions, just like the more technical people have the solution. It's finding out what works in a local context with that particular considerations that are there, because it's not just one solution and you can take from one context to another, which is the issue. I think so. The speciality matters a lot, and it's that thing I think we need to underline. But it's super hard to communicate that is a field of expertise, if you like. Why should I, as an urban planner, know something more or better about where to place solar panels than the one investing in it and has a business case? And maybe I don't in that particular situation, but maybe there's a wider perspective that gets lost if you just focus on this piece of land, in isolation. But it's difficult to communicate, and it's difficult to understand why that is needed. It's difficult. It's easy to see when it's not done what the problems of it are, but when you manage to succeed to do it in a good way, you don't see the problems that could have been there if you hadn't done it that way. I hope that makes sense what I'm saying. At least you're nodding. Good. Yeah.
Thank you so much. It was a very interesting presentation. I have a question that maybe follows up on the two previous questions. And
Sorry, was distracted one moment. Go on.
No, it's fine. I was saying I have a question that probably follows up on the two previous questions. And my question was about your opinion on maybe multi-stakeholder decision making in this planning process, right? Because the different stakeholders engaged both from local to national levels, or even in terms of fields, from technical researchers and everything. I mean, I do believe they have different priorities, and maybe based on your experience, perhaps in Denmark, also some work that you've done on other project, you could have some reflections on the zones of tension in this decision making, in making this strategic planning processes and plans. And I mean, what are some of the gray zones that you think could be interesting to invest more to explore?
Yeah. I think there is I'm hesitating now because there is a danger that I'm going to sound like an anti-planner for a moment. So just bear with me. But at least, I mean, one of the critiques of planning and state bureaucracy and institutions that we create in the public sector is that sometimes it comes across as the main function of these institutions is to stay alive and have their own sort of logic of how they work, and a quite sort of self-preservation in a sense. So you're absolutely right that municipalities, for example, would have one logic and one mindset, and regions would have different, and to take the national level in, a third perspective. And they've been set in the world to serve certain interests and fulfill certain tasks. And they are of course the interests and the ideas that they then bring to a table when they meet. So in that sense, it's natural they disagree or come with different perspectives and have different agendas, because that's where they come from. So I think you need to understand that. And there is maybe an element that if they go too far into something they shouldn't do, then they could be criticized, and then they could be abolished or taken away or something else. So I think that the history from Denmark is that these counties we had before were actually quite good at making sure that you don't have urban sprawl, because every urban development plan had to be approved not only by the municipality but also by the county, which meant that the municipalities got very fed up with the counties and therefore mobilized politically in order to get them removed. And then they were removed, and then the municipalities got the priority to decide themselves how to prioritize the urban development, with the idea that the ministry then should look at them. And then the ministry, through time, have decided how much they want to look at what the municipalities are doing. So my point here is that it is difficult, but we should find common ground, maybe not so much in the small things first, but in in the bigger things. And I think in Denmark and in Sweden you have some overall political goals of where we want to hit, and I know they're quite broad and vague, but they usually come with a figure and then a date in terms of CO2 reduction or whatever. It's just a matter of can we move backwards? Can we from that backcast? What do we have to then to do? Can we translate that into something more tangible? Which is a super tricky exercise. What does that mean then, literally, in this situation, if we are to take that goal seriously? And I think that's the translation process that hasn't been done. We don't start with that goal. We start with our immediate situation, what's possible, and so on. How are we restrained by the public budget and all these kind of things and tasks? So I think to be fair to the public sector is it has so many tasks to solve and so little resources to do it. So it's sort of survival mode. So how can you do anything extra?
This could rebound quickly, but then it can sort of create a vicious circle, right? Because then when we look at the technical aspects of it, also you have the grid operators that have their own constraints, and also the private investors that are thinking about their OPEX, CAPEX, and all those things that work together. So there's a bit of a certain divide if you want to look at maybe developing, I don't know, a strategic planning or a plan for energy transition in, I would say, towards 2050. So, I mean, there's a lot of factors that come together. So the public sector part is like one facade of the situation, but then also you have the whole technical and economic and social aspect that's come into relations, which creates this kind of tension. So I would dare to say, and it's a bit of a critique, but then it's a bit of a running in circle
yeah.
But at some point, decisions have to be made, right?
Yeah.
And this is where maybe I think the role of the urban planner is quite important also, but then how to trigger, obtain this attention and this focus to deliver the work that's supposed to be done. And this is what I'm trying to understand. I mean, I believe you have more experience in it.
Yeah. But it's, you're definitely on the right track with your thinking. And I'm just thinking, bridging to the other comments before. In Denmark, you can have a little bit of sort of, the ostrich mentality where you just put your head in a bush and then, everything disappears in a sense. And in Denmark, we had this, what our prime minister at some point, and she actually said it, called the hockey stick strategy. So, hockey stick goes like this. So the idea is we do nothing, we do nothing, we do nothing, we do nothing, we do nothing. And then at some point we hope that a new technology comes and then we reach the target in the end. Which is a little bit like, when you have to hand in an essay or something for a course, you do nothing, you do nothing, you do nothing. And then, the last 24 hours, you just keep awake and then you just write it. I don't think that's going to make the best essay. But maybe you're different. But, and she was at a press conference really and explained this thing about the hockey stick. And you could probably find it online still because it was so funny and sad at the same time. So you absolutely, we need to act faster. We need to do something now. And as urban planners, we need to be able to demonstrate how we can contribute. Not saying we can solve everything, but we just, need to demonstrate how we can contribute together with us.
Great, thanks. An online question. First, also online, the request whether you can, people would like to see you.
Yeah.
I think you have to stop sharing.
I think I stopped sharing, but I can see I still have, maybe I do like this.
Yeah.
Is that better? Should I could also put the...
No, we don't see anything.
I could put the camera...
You have to stop.
Start my video. Maybe. Let's see. Have I been out video the whole time?
Yes, perfect.
I'm sorry about that.
Great. No, it's perfectly fine. And a little question. So Kaiser says, thank you very much for your thought-provoking presentation. how would you see the relationship between strategic urban planning and strategic spatial planning?
Mhm. I think we sometimes use those words interchangeably. So for me, I'm not. For me, spatial planning is maybe a more sort of European concept, a European way of talking about planning at something that goes across the different European countries where planning is called something differently. Where urban maybe, I don't know, I guess it sort of relates to a more urban context somehow, but everything is also so urban today doesn't necessarily mean only something physically urban. It could also be urban mentality and all these kind of things, right? So I don't really see it. I think my answer would be that I prefer one term or the other, but I don't necessarily would see them any different. But maybe there's something I'm overlooking there.
Good. I have a question myself also. Not sure how to put it, but it's more about how much spatial planning actually is kind of a distinct policy field and how it interrelates, interacts with other policies. So as you put also at the beginning, it's very, so that spatial planning is really good in kind of diagnosing spatial consequences of developments and also of ambitions, where you would like to have more social housing or so, but doesn't have the tools very often to do the things. So where you have to rely on other actors. But then you have other policy fields, probably like housing policies, which have the tools, but don't have the spatial consciousness or whatever. And so in the end, you need both. And the question is, so what would be the role then for spatial planning, not as a prescriptive policy areas which can inform certain things. So would this need then just a lot of communication between the different areas, or would it be rather something which across policy fields tries to analyze the spatial dimensions of these, but then you still need these other policies which have to implement things, or how do you see planning in the context of other policies?
Yeah, and it's a very good question, and this is where things starts to get messy and maybe less well thought through / less easy to communicate. But of course, you need sector planning in a sense. The problem is if you in each sector have a sort of a silo mentality and don't necessarily look to the sector next to you. So for me, spatial planning is something that could cut across sectors and bring these different considerations together, bringing in the spatial dimension that often gets lost, I still feel, when you just do silo mentality. But then I also, there is this danger that you then talk about spatial planning as being something that is about everything, and then maybe nothing, in a sense. So I would insist on that spatial planning, strategic spatial planning, is a discipline, has a core knowledge that is separate and different from the others in order to just justify it as a practice and something we should do and something that has value in itself beyond and detached somewhat to the sector planning, rather than a simple add-on umbrella thing that cuts across. But that's where it gets tricky, because communicating that message is not easy. I hope that makes sense. I feel like I need to draw on a whiteboard or something, but maybe I'll skip that now. But something that cuts across, but with its own core competencies attached to it, and that's where I try to emphasize a little bit this thing with the speciality, the way of things, and how things connect, and maybe has an ability to demonstrate where things disconnect and the need for have a more, I guess, more holistic is maybe a good word perspective to it.
But beyond the knowledge field, kind of, is there a strategic planning decision making? So
Yeah.
are there policies then? So that, because then you start to kind of
Yeah.
the way of, or I don't know.
I mean, for me, strategic spatial plan, I mean, it depends on what you mean by the difference between policy and but it is creating these sort of visions that can be grand, but they need to be somehow attached to very specific bullet points that would lead to action. So my point before was that maybe we have these ideas with 100% renewable or CO2 neutral in 2050, but we need to break down what that means. We need to have other targets to work by. So we can have the grand vision if that's the policy, but somehow we need to decompose that into smaller steps. What does that mean? And I'm not just thinking, 20% in 2030 or something like that, but what does it actually mean? What is it we need to do in order to do that? How are we to live and work differently if we are to achieve these goals? How are we going to organize the space differently in order to facilitate that? And so this thing, we haven't really solved with the transportation sector, and we're sort of hoping that electric cars would solve everything, but they just sort of create new problems in a sense, right? So why are we not investing more in public transport or in a third version of mobility that somehow can help us solve these challenges more easily? Why should you own your private car? Or should you have a special permission to, I don't know. But I'm just, we need somehow to break down these things more easily.
Yes, also, but there is a follow-up.
Yeah, of course.
A quick follow-up on the first question on the urban and just.
Yeah, sorry, because I didn't really answer that.
Yes, the question was based on the idea that spatial planning creates a platform for action, but it cannot organize or lead operative actions. At least in the Finnish context, the connection between city strategies and spatial planning tensions. Stop. So it's a bit incomplete, the sentence.
So what I hear, what I understand from what you say, is that there's a disconnect between spatial planning, maybe at a regional scale, and urban planning then at a municipal city level.
Wait a sec. Kaisa, do you want to ask the question directly? I think you are online now. No, it doesn't. Okay. Okay, then we just go.
But she can come back to me if she wants.
Yes, please get in.
Get in touch.
If you can hear me.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. The question space it's kind of this connection between, at least in Finnish context, it's including quite a lot tensions. Cities are making strategies which are including all these actions, for example, related to housing policies and for energy policies. But then how the connection between spatial planning is done and how that planning system is working, it from several perspectives, it looks like that those two parts are partly disconnected, or there are several tensions between these two ways of thinking. If the kind of the question, if the only tool is the spatial planning, it cannot be solve everything. It's more like if you see a problem which looks like a nail, the only tool you can have is a hammer. But if the challenges are more kind of wider. You need to have all the action, different kind of actions working simultaneously with these things which are planned in spatial planning. And for that reason, I was kind of asking and would like to hear your view, how you see these kind of different ways of plan, this kind of urban planning, and from your research perspective, how do you see this kind of action planning side of this planning in general in cities?
So the way I understand you is that, if we think about urban planning is related to, the city scale, the city level, and if each municipality, each city just do their own planning, then that could create some friction or some unfortunate side effects if we think about inter-urban competition and all these kind of things. So in that sense, we need some kind of spatial framework or strategic spatial planning at a larger scale, city region scale, regional scale, something that somehow takes into consideration that these negative side effects doesn't take place or try to alleviate them somehow. Is that the correct one?
In a way, kind of seeing spatial planning as a part of city general planning.
Yeah.
I made a quick look or took a quick look on for example, city visions and how those are applied and how kind of the futures thinking is kind of used in the cities, and notice that quite often cities are having different kind of projects which are trying to solve different kind of things, and quite often the tool is to use urban spatial planning to solve these questions. But if you have a city which is kind of targeting something and they have some kind of vision what they want to achieve, they need different kind of actions and different kind of actants to act to be able to fulfill these targets. And if everything is kind of done in silos, it doesn't make things happen. And for that reason, I would like to just hear your views on those parts which are not solved by the spatial planning when cities want to develop themselves.
Yeah. Okay, but I think I get your point. I think you're right, and you answer something here. I think one of the issues that also is connected with this is the planning still also today is quite project oriented. So cities are part of these sort of different EU funded projects where they have funding to do something experiments for 3 years, maybe 5 years. And then when that project is done, then that's done. and so this sort of project mentality and the funding that comes with that, and maybe the staff that is funded through these projects then disappear after those 3-4 years. So developing the connection between these projects, which sometimes takes place in silos, sometimes maybe cut across, and then the more institutionalized way of doing planning, which is more sort of broad across the different sectors in the municipality, is a challenge. And I from what I know in a Danish context is that municipalities are very much struggling with finding organizational spaces that cuts across the different sectors where people with different specializations and competences meet and talk and organize things in a meaningful way. And it's often the first thing that gets cut away when you need to cut costs. So there's a huge challenge there, which for me is connected to this idea of, do we understand what spatial planning is for? Do we understand why it's needed? Do we appreciate that that is an important activity or not? And if it's not prioritized, then of course these plans just sit on the shelf and doesn't really do anything. and doesn't frame the activities and the thinking of people working in the different departments, if you like, of a municipality. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I work as a regional spatial planner here in Sweden, in Östergötland. So I'm of course a bit curious and interesting in what Denmark is doing right now with the regional level, stripping the regions from mandate or responsibilities. So that's maybe not so much a question, but your reflections or your views on what the regional level in Denmark, where Denmark is heading, a less regional level and more of the municipality and the national level when it comes to, for example, spatial planning and planning.
Yeah. So what's going on at the regional level in Denmark at the moment? Very little. Is the short answer. I mean, we do, of course, we still have the finger plan in Copenhagen, which is sort of city level or regional, if you like. But if we're talking about the regions as being the institutionalized regions, the 5 regions we have in Denmark, I think we just combined 2 of them. Maybe we only have 4. Anyways, their primary function is to run the hospitals, the healthcare service. They organize also public transport because it cuts across, of course, municipal boundaries and things like that. They did more things related to spatial planning in the past. Some would probably say they still do something, but it's not something I, as a researcher, look to. I don't have the impression that something people spend a lot of attention to. What we see happening is instead maybe that the municipalities use the regions as a way to group themselves and have conversations about how they can mobilize and represent their regional interest towards the Danish, government, national level, but also just internally. So now in northern Jutland, where I'm from, there've been these discussions about, okay, for example, we have the 2050 as a goal for 100% renewable energy. Should we have 2040 in northern Jutland, for example, because we have all these energy parks and we're probably not going to, or will have these energy parks, we're probably going to reach that target anyway. Could that position us better branding-wise, economic-wise, something like that? So there are some kind of planning going on, but not in a sense I would call strategic spatial planning. But policy coordination, maybe. Municipalities talk to each other within these regions, but it's not necessarily sort of organized necessarily by a region. They might be the ones calling for the meeting. So very, very little. I mean, I feel that the national level also does very little planning. So it's very much municipal driven. Of course, they look at what they're doing, but they're more processing, making sure that you stay within the legal frameworks and things like that, rather than actually producing any meaningful policies that is supposed to lead the municipalities. And then they start to use the Planning Act as a way to communicate what they would like the municipalities to do. So they put in new requirements in the act, and then the municipalities have to do it. So in sort of using the legal framework as a way to communicate interest to municipalities, rather than in a grand vision policy document. So a more and this is my point again, is this more sort of regulatory focus on what planning is about, what planning should be about, this sort of more minimal planning in a way, rather than umbrella strategic planning. That would be my diagnosis. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, a question online.
Yes, one more online question. Miranda wants to ask about the national plan. Miranda, can you try to ask yourself? You're online now. Otherwise, I'll ask for you. So thanks for the interesting presentation. My question would be, you talked about the Danish national plan at the beginning. What were the principal critiques of the national spatial planning framework? And if there were some, what political, institutional, socioeconomic conditions are necessary for a national spatial plan to be successfully implemented?
Yeah.
Or would you rather say this approach of national spatial planning is outdated for today's reality?
I think, I mean, so the example that I started with was the National Spatial Plan from 2006, which for me is an example of where you wanted to do something with the National Spatial Plan. So there was a purpose with writing it. You didn't only just publish the document. You set up some processes following up. So that was those dialogue processes that I talked about. So in a sense, you used it as a starting point for creating something new approach, new processes, new way of doing things. What happened afterwards was that the idea of what a national spatial planning should be and what you wanted to use it for were different. So you, in a sense, you did them because you had to. And some of them were quite short, sort of 20 pages. So that a pixie version of a planning report. And then, of course, they are useless. Then they don't do anything, they don't mean anything. And then you might as well just get rid of them, which I think is also the fault that has led to that we don't have them anymore. So I think we've been struggling with finding out what we should use them for, and finding ways to use them in a good way, because the understanding of what strategic spatial planning is for has disappeared. So the natural decision is, of course, to get rid of them because they don't mean anything. There's no point spending time on having a document that nobody pays attention to. I actually think planners pay attention to them and would like to see the national government's view of what Denmark's look like, spatially. What are the planning ideas, the challenges that they are concerned about, and how do you put them into a planning context, which is for me what that document could be. And then coupled with some initiatives, and I think we've had those initiatives in Denmark still. So we've had ideas that you should do strategic planning for small town centers in cities where the commercial life is declining in the town center, shops closing down and so on. We need strategic planning there. We've had the idea you should do strategic planning for villages or rural areas, with the idea that people are moving away from rural areas. Some villages would die out, some would survive. Could we make a strategy for which one has the most potential, and then we focus our activity there to build up the community there, and then we let the others, run their own course. And so having strategic decisions about what to do. So these ideas have been put into the planning framework now and again, and then taking out again because that was too much planning, or just extra work for the municipal planners who don't get any more resources to do it. They just get more demands, and then they complain, and then you pull it out again. So that was a long talk, but I think if we are to put in strategic spatial planning again at national level or at any other scale, it should be in a meaningful way. And it should be in a way where we want to use it as a starting point to create some momentum in order to start a process, to do something, to get actors to act in a different way than they did before, and to bring actors together. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. I think it's 12 o'clock, so we need to stop. Thank you so much for this discussion, and very good about strategic spatial planning and all the interest about it. So let's continue this discussion, but thank you so much for coming here, Kristian.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for having me.